The royal chandeliers of Buckingham Palace glittered like constellations above a room filled with power, pride, and centuries of buried guilt. Diplomats, generals, and journalists filled the Grand Hall, waiting for the African Summit on Commonwealth Partnerships to begin. Cameras clicked, glasses clinked, and behind it all stood the image of a golden crown, shining like history's most beautiful lie. King Charles entered with his usual calm gravitas, every step echoing the authority of an empire long past but never forgotten. When he approached the podium, applause rippled through the hall. It wasn't admiration, it was protocol. Today, Charles began, his voice smooth but heavy with self-importance, we celebrate the shared legacy between Britain and Africa. The crown built empires that connected continents, advanced civilization, and forged progress. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. In the third row, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso sat silently, his dark suit a sharp contrast to the glittering uniforms and polished medals around him. He didn't clap, he didn't smile. His eyes, sharp as a soldier's blade, fixed on the man who called conquest, connection. Charles continued, our partnership has endured through the test of time. The British Empire laid foundations that continue to benefit our Commonwealth family. Across the room, murmurs began. A few African delegates exchanged glances, uneasy, embarrassed, furious. But none dared to speak, none except one. When Charles finished, applause filled the air again, forced, hollow, obedient. Then came the voice that shattered it all. Your Majesty, Traoré said, standing. His voice carried across the hall with disarming calm. You say the crown built empires. That's true. But let us also say what those empires were built on, the backs of Africans, the blood of slaves, and the bones of nations buried beneath your progress. The room froze. The cameras swiveled. King Charles blinked, unsure whether to respond as a monarch or a man. You built empires, Traoré continued, his tone steady, but you built them on African graves. A silence so sharp it could cut through marble descended over Buckingham Palace. The moment the world would talk about for years had just begun. For a long second, no one breathed. The chandeliers above flickered faintly as if the palace itself hesitated. Then whispers rippled through the hall, cautious, electrified, scandalized. Some British officials shifted in their seats, others stared straight ahead, praying the cameras would cut away. But they didn't. Every lens in the room stayed locked on Ibrahim Traoré. King Charles forced a polite smile, the kind that British royalty had perfected over centuries of diplomacy and denial. President Traoré, he said, voice smooth but brittle, I understand your passion. But surely, we can agree that history is complex. That the past cannot be judged by the standards of the present. Traoré took a step forward, his eyes unflinching. History may be complex, Your Majesty, he replied, but suffering is not. A child in chains does not call it progress. A mother watching her land burn does not call it civilization. And no African calls the theft of his gold a partnership. A murmur of agreement spread among several African delegates. The British press began to stir, journalists whispered frantically into microphones. The tension was no longer political, it was historical, personal, and undeniable. Charles's composure cracked. Our nations have moved beyond that era, he said, his voice rising slightly. The crown has long supported Africa's development, its stability, its... Traoré interrupted, his tone cutting through the air like thunder. Supported? You took. You extracted. You renamed our lands, our people, and called it order. You broke our bodies and called it trade. You erased our gods and called it faith. And now you call it history. The hall fell silent again. The BBC camera zoomed in on Traoré's face, unshaken, unafraid, radiant with conviction. He continued, lowering his voice but not his intensity. You say the crown built empires. I say it buried nations. You call it legacy. I call it theft with ceremony. Charles's expression hardened. His advisors signaled discreetly, suggesting he end the exchange, but he stood still, trapped by the weight of his own empire's ghosts. Outside the palace, protesters who had gathered for the summit began to chant Traoré's name. News alerts flashed across phones. Burkina Faso's president confronts King Charles, live. The world was watching, and history, for once, was speaking back. The camera zoomed tighter on Traoré, the lone man standing against centuries of power wrapped in velvet. He didn't need a script, or a crown, or a throne. His voice itself had become the weapon. King Charles took a measured breath, glancing briefly toward his aides. They looked as pale as the palace walls. The silence had grown dangerous. One wrong word could ignite a fire larger than any royal could contain. Finally, the king spoke, his tone clipped with royal restraint. President Traoré, he said, we are here to discuss cooperation, not confrontation. Traoré smiled faintly, but his eyes never softened. Cooperation, he repeated. A beautiful word, Your Majesty. But cooperation cannot exist between the thief and the robbed, between the hunter and the hunted. A few gasps cut through the tension. The queen consort shifted uneasily. Across the hall, African diplomats straightened in their chairs. The courage they'd buried beneath protocol began to surface. Charles raised a hand, trying to steady his dignity. You speak as if Britain has not changed, as if the world remains what it once was. Traoré's gaze sharpened. Has it changed? The flags have, perhaps. The chains are invisible now, forged not from iron but from debt, trade conditions, and sanctions. The crown may have lost its colonies, but it kept their wealth. The words hit like bullets wrapped in truth. One of the British officials whispered something sharply into an earpiece. A press officer muttered, cut the feed. But it was too late. The live broadcast had already gone viral. On social media, millions were watching in real time. Hashtags began to flood across screens. Hashtag Traoré versus the Crown, hashtag African Truth, hashtag Empire Exposed. Comment sections erupted, some praising Traoré's courage, others furious that anyone would disrespect a monarch. But for Africans watching across the world, it was more than a confrontation, it was vindication. Traoré took a final step closer to the podium. Your Majesty, he said quietly, you built empires on our blood. Yet we are still here. You took our gold, but not our spirit. You erased our names, but not our history. And now, we have come not to ask, but to remind. Charles stood frozen, his royal composure fractured. For the first time in a long reign, the crown had nothing left to say. The air inside Buckingham Palace felt heavy now, as if the ghosts of empire had gathered to witness their reckoning. Reporters' flashes painted the gold-trimmed walls in bursts of white light, catching every tense expression, every bead of sweat. No one dared to interrupt Ibrahim Traoré, not even the king's press secretary, who sat gripping her notes like a lifeline. Traoré stepped closer to the podium, his voice lowering but carrying further. When the crown took Africa's gold, he said, it wasn't just metal you stole. You took the foundation of nations, the breath of generations. That gold built your palaces, your railways, your wars. And now you tell us it was for progress? King Charles exhaled slowly, visibly trying to control the storm behind his eyes. History, he began carefully, is full of pain on all sides. But surely we must look forward, not backward. Traoré tilted his head, a cold smile curving his lips. Forward? Tell that to the children mining cobalt today for Western companies. Tell it to the farmers whose lands are seized by corporations under your flags. You don't want to move forward, Your Majesty, you want to keep walking in circles where you always lead. A sharp gasp rose from the British delegation. The African leaders in attendance exchanged looks, shock at first, then something bolder, pride. For the first time in years, someone had said what they all whispered behind closed doors. Charles tried again, his tone brittle. You cannot hold today's generation responsible for the deeds of their ancestors. Traoré's response came like thunder. And yet your banks still hold our ancestors' gold. Your museums still display our gods behind glass. You eat from plates molded from the wealth of our soil. If the sins of the past no longer matter, then why does the profit still flow one way? The silence that followed was almost spiritual, a deep, collective awareness that the veil of diplomacy had been torn apart. The crown, for once, stood naked in the eyes of truth. Then Traoré leaned slightly forward and said, "The difference between you and me, your majesty, is simple. You inherited your power. I earned mine, from a people who still know hunger, still know pain, and yet still stand." The hall trembled with the weight of his words. Even the king's stoic expression faltered, his jaw tightening. He finally understood, this was no political speech. This was history answering back. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that doesn't fade but grows, feeding on tension and truth. The journalists in the hall barely blinked, their pens frozen midair. The live broadcast had stopped feeling like diplomacy, it had become a reckoning. King Charles adjusted his cuffs, a small attempt to regain control. "President Traoré," he said finally, his tone measured but cold, "you speak with such anger, such accusation. But you forget, the British Empire also brought education, infrastructure, and governance to lands that had none." That was it. The spark that ignited the explosion. Traoré laughed softly, the sound sharp enough to slice through the marble echoes of the palace. "Education? You mean teaching us that our names were wrong, our languages inferior, our gods false? Infrastructure? You mean the railways that led straight to your ships, the ones carrying our gold, our cotton, our people?" Gasps filled the room. The king's advisors looked panicked now. But Traoré didn't stop. "You call it governance," he said, voice rising. "We call it rule by the gun. You call it civilization, we call it the erasure of souls. And you call it legacy, but what you built was a graveyard dressed in silk." A camera flash caught Traoré's face mid-sentence, intense, commanding, alive with conviction. It was the image that would soon circle the world, the young African president confronting the last symbol of empire in its own palace. Charles's knuckles whitened on the podium. "You exaggerate," he said tightly. "You distort what cannot be undone." Traoré's voice dropped to a low, calm tone, far more dangerous than anger. "No, your majesty. I correct what has been rewritten. And I remind you of what your empire buried, not just bodies, but truth." The British press in the back began whispering. One reporter mouthed, "This is historic." Outside the palace, the crowd had grown massive. Africans from across the UK were gathering with flags, chanting Traoré's name. Videos streamed online, captioned, "Africa speaks back." King Charles, feeling the walls closing in, finally said, "Then what do you want, Mr. Traoré?" "Vengeance?" Traoré stepped closer, looking the monarch straight in the eyes. "Not vengeance, your majesty. Balance. Justice. The return of what was taken, not just gold, but dignity." The world was no longer just watching a summit. It was watching a reversal, the empire being lectured by its former colony. The tension in the royal hall had become unbearable. Even the walls seemed to listen, the portraits of past kings watching, their painted faces frozen in guilt. King Charles exhaled slowly, his voice brittle but proud. "Justice, you say. But history cannot be rewritten. What's done is done." Traoré's eyes narrowed. "History can't be rewritten, but it can be corrected. You see, your majesty, Africa is no longer asking for permission to stand. We're standing already. What we demand now is recognition, and restoration." "Restoration?" Charles repeated, as if the word itself offended him. "Yes," Traoré said calmly, "the return of what was stolen. Our artifacts, our minerals, our wealth, the very lifeblood of our continent that now rests in your vaults. You call them relics of heritage. I call them trophies of theft." A murmur of shock swept through the British audience. The African diplomats, emboldened by Traoré's defiance, nodded subtly, their expressions firm. For decades, they had bowed in silence, but now someone was speaking every word they had swallowed. Charles's tone sharpened. "And you think the crown will simply hand over its treasures? You misunderstand diplomacy, Mr. Traoré." Traoré took a slow step forward. "No, your majesty. I understand diplomacy perfectly. It's the art of making theft sound like partnership. But I no longer play by those rules. The cameras caught the flicker of fury in the king's eyes. "Careful," Charles warned, his voice trembling slightly. "You tread on dangerous ground." Traoré's answer was steady, cold, and unforgettable. "I have walked on dangerous ground my entire life, the ground your ancestors stole and called theirs. So no, your majesty. I'm not the one who should be careful." The audience gasped, the air seemed to shatter. For a moment, even the king's guards glanced nervously at each other. Outside, the chants had grown louder. Thousands of voices roared, "Africa will not kneel." The energy bled into the palace like thunder, echoing through the centuries of silence that Britain had imposed. Traoré's words rang clear over the noise. "You speak of civilization, but your civilization was built on the bones of ours. And now, we have come to claim what was lost, not through war, but through truth. And truth, your majesty, is a weapon sharper than any sword your empire ever forged." King Charles stood frozen, not just as a ruler, but as a man facing the ghost of every crown that came before him. The palace had turned into a courtroom of history. The chandeliers swayed lightly, casting golden reflections over faces that could no longer hide behind diplomacy. Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, his presence defying centuries of arrogance, while King Charles clung to the last threads of royal composure. "Mr. Traoré," the king began, his tone now colder, clipped with restrained irritation. "You speak boldly for a man whose nation once relied on the empire's guidance. Without Britain's structure, would Burkina Faso even stand today?" A few gasps echoed. It was a statement soaked in the old poison, superiority disguised as civility. Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and strength. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "we stood long before Britain learned to sail. We had kingdoms, mathematics, architecture, and philosophy while your ancestors painted themselves blue and called it culture. So yes, Burkina Faso stands, because Africa has always stood." The room erupted. A few reporters gasped audibly. African delegates clapped quietly, ignoring the disapproving looks of their Western counterparts. The crown's myth was unraveling, live, on camera. Charles clenched his jaw. "You are rewriting history, President Traoré." "No," Traoré said, voice like iron. "I am remembering it. That's what frightens you. Because when Africa remembers, the world changes." Those words rippled like thunder beyond the palace walls. In Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Bamako, people watching the broadcast began sharing the clip. Within minutes, it became the #1 trending video on social media. Traoré to King Charles, Africa remembers. Traoré stepped even closer, lowering his tone to something more personal, almost intimate. "You wear the crown, your majesty, but the weight of it isn't gold, it's guilt. Every gem in that crown was once a tear from our soil." King Charles looked down for the first time. For a fleeting moment, there was no monarch, just a man realizing that his inheritance was built on the suffering of others. Traoré continued, his voice steady. "We are not here to beg, or to bow. We are here to tell you, the time when Africa whispered is over. Now, we speak. And the world listens." The crowd inside the palace rose, half in awe, half in shock. But one thing was clear, this was not diplomacy anymore. This was a reckoning centuries in the making. The tremor in the room was no longer fear, it was awakening. Reporters whispered frantically, their fingers trembling as they typed headlines that would soon circle the globe. The king's face had gone pale, the royal mask stripped away. Ibrahim Traoré stood tall under the glow of the chandeliers, but it was not the palace light that made him shine, it was truth. King Charles finally broke the silence, his voice low but defensive. "Mr. Traoré, you speak of guilt as if the past can be undone. The world has moved on. Modern Britain has no colonies." Traoré's eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 buried names. "No colonies? Then why are our resources still drained under your corporation's contracts? Why does the wealth of Africa still flow through London's banks? Colonies may have changed names, but the chains remain the same, only shinier. The crowd stirred. The truth was too sharp, too specific to ignore. One of the king's aides whispered something into his ear, but Charles raised a hand. He wanted to answer himself. "You misunderstand the nature of modern economics," he said stiffly. "Trade is voluntary." Traoré leaned closer. "Voluntary? Tell me, Your Majesty, is it voluntary when a hungry man sells his bread to the one who took his field? Is it trade when the balance of power is written by the conqueror's hand?" The king's eyes flickered. He looked toward the cameras, realizing that every word, every breath, was being recorded for history. Traoré continued, his tone steady and piercing. "You say the crown built empires. I say Africa built the world. Our gold gilded your churches. Our diamonds crowned your queens. Our sweat powered your revolution. You didn't build civilization, you outsourced its cost to us." A sharp collective inhale swept through the room. Even some British officials dropped their gaze. "Your Majesty," Traoré said, his voice softening but not yielding, "this isn't about hate. It's about acknowledgement. Because the day the powerful admit the truth is the day the world begins to heal." For the first time, Charles didn't respond. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. He just stared, not at Traoré, but at the ground beneath him. As if realizing that even this palace, this kingdom, stood on African earth once stolen, now remembered. Outside, London erupted in sound, thousands chanting one name. Traoré. 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 The monarch of an empire had fallen silent before the voice of a soldier from a nation once enslaved. The night outside Buckingham Palace had transformed into something never before seen in London. Protesters, students, and activists from across the city gathered behind the gates, Africans, Caribbeans, Arabs, even British citizens holding signs that read, "Return what you stole." Others simply held portraits of Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had walked into the empire's heart and spoken like no one dared before. Inside, the king retreated to his private chamber. His advisors surrounded him, whispering about damage control, statements, and press releases. But Charles barely listened. The echo of Traoré's words had carved itself into his mind. Every gem in that crown was once a tear from our soil. Meanwhile, in his hotel room, Traoré sat by the window overlooking the glowing city. He could see the reflection of the palace from afar, the same palace that once ruled continents. "Empires," he murmured, "they fall not when their enemies attack, but when their lies collapse." Marie, his advisor, entered quietly. "Mr. President," she said, "you've made headlines everywhere. London, New York, Lagos, the world is watching." He turned to her with calm certainty. "Good. Let them watch. Maybe they'll finally see." As dawn broke, news anchors replayed his speech across global networks. Some praised his courage. Others condemned his tone. But no one ignored him. Editorials flooded the internet. Africa's new voice challenges the crown. The empire faces its mirror. At the British Parliament, a heated debate erupted. Opposition members accused the monarchy of clinging to colonial silence. "If Traoré can face history with courage," one MP said, "why can't we?" In Africa, the reaction was electric. Students painted murals of Traoré standing before the king, a lion facing a crown. Hashtags surged across social media, hashtag Africa remembers, hashtag the crown of graves. Traoré's phone buzzed, messages from presidents, ministers, and youth leaders across the continent. Some called him a hero. Others a revolutionary. But he only smiled faintly and said, "I'm just a soldier who tells the truth." Then, quietly, he added, "And truth doesn't need permission to speak." Back in the palace, King Charles gazed at the ancient crown resting on velvet. The jewels glittered beautifully, but now, all he could see were faces. Faces of men and women who never lived to see freedom. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time, the weight of the crown felt real. The final day of the visit dawned under a heavy sky. Rain clouds loomed over London, as if the heavens themselves weighed the words spoken between Traoré and the king. The palace guards stood at attention, cameras lined the gates, and the world waited for what would happen next. When Ibrahim Traoré arrived once more at Buckingham Palace, the tension was electric. The crowd outside had grown to tens of thousands, Africans waving flags, British citizens holding signs that read, "Truth is the new crown." Inside, King Charles waited. But this time, there was no arrogance in his posture, no royal pretense. As Traoré entered the hall, the king rose to greet him, not as a ruler greeting a subject, but as one man facing another whose words had shaken the world. "Mr. President," Charles began softly, "I've had much to think about. You were right. The empire built its wealth on suffering. But how does one repay the dead?" Traoré paused. "By protecting the living," he said simply. "By giving back what still breathes, our heritage, our voice, our dignity. That is how we start." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then the king gave a slow nod. Then perhaps the crown must finally listen. The next week, an unprecedented announcement shook global headlines: the British monarchy begins returning African artifacts. The news spread like wildfire. Crowds celebrated in Ouagadougou, Dakar, Accra, Nairobi. Cities that had once been shadows in the empire's map now stood as symbols of revival. At the ceremony in Burkina Faso, Traoré held one of the first returned items, a bronze mask looted a century earlier. He lifted it toward the crowd and said, "This is not just metal. It is memory. And memory, once stolen, is now home." Applause erupted, tears flowed, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to balance again. Later that evening, Traoré stood alone beneath the same stars that once watched his ancestors chained and stolen away. "We are not here to erase history," he whispered, "but to finish it." And somewhere in London, King Charles looked out his palace window, the echoes of Traoré's words still haunting him. The crown had not fallen, but it had finally bowed. Because that night, one truth stood taller than any empire ever had. Africa had spoken, and the world had listened.